Hey everybody, I wanted to talk about a study I saw that I thought was very interesting for people who have similar backgrounds to mine, people that grew up in abusive homes with abusive or narcissistic parents and family members, or family members with mental illness that left them with like childhood trauma. This is a very interesting study. Um, Here is the article on it. This is from 2017. Two UW Madison professors investigate childhood trauma effects. It's not that people are overtly deciding to take these negative risks or do things that might get them in trouble. It may very well be that their brains are not really processing the information that should tell them they are headed to a bad place, that this is not the right step to take, unquote. Seth Pollack, a UW-Madison psychology professor, has spent years studying the effects of stress on children. Adults who endured high levels of stress within their childhood have difficulty reading signs of potential punishment or loss, which makes them vulnerable to certain avoidable health, legal, and financial problems. I'm sure many people can relate. According to a study conducted by researchers at UW-Madison, this problem may in fact be biological, stemming from certain inactivity in the brain where a situation should be triggering awareness. This discovery may help educate at youth risk to avoid risky situations. Pollack and an additional UW-Madison psychiatry professor, Rasmus Byrne, conducted an experiment with 50 people aged 19 to 23. These participants participated in a previous study with Pollack when they were 8 years old. The participants were those who endured high stress levels as children, such as parents killed by gunfire or substance abuse, maltreatment, and foster home placements. The participants were put through several tasks while their brain functionality was measured for activity areas of loss, risk, and reward in the brain. Results showed that high childhood stress participants were less attentive to a potential loss situation than the low childhood stress group and were more stimulated by losses. The high stress childhood group also reported more risky behaviors: smoking, not wearing a seatbelt in a car, or texting while driving, compared to low stress participants. To the researchers' surprise, it was solely the participants' childhood stress level, not the stress in their current lives, that was a predictor of their abilities to identify potential losses or avoiding risky behaviors. Quote, so many of our behavioral interventions are predicated on the idea that people will understand there's a sign that they're about to be punished, unquote, Pollack said. Maybe we need to rethink some of those things. The researchers plan to further investigate their findings and continue researching this topic. Quote, now that we have this finding, we can use it to guide us to look at specific networks in the brain that are active and functionally connected, unquote, Byrne said. Quote, we may find that childhood stress reshapes the way communication happens across the brain. I think that is pretty obvious. I also think that they know these things. If you've looked at like MK Ultra and what they were doing, the kinds of experiments they were doing on children, they were trying to induce split personality and stuff like that. And the way that they were doing that was severely traumatizing a child like before the age of 3. This gave them the ability to create multiple personalities in the child that they could then program. and activate, like activating different personalities at different times. The child's brain does this. It shatters and dissociates as a survival mechanism. So obviously this makes sense. So gambling against the odds on life's risks more common after childhood stress. Adults who lived high-stress childhoods have trouble reading the signs that a loss or punishment is looming, leaving themselves in situations that risk avoidable health and financial problems and legal trouble. According to researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, this difficulty may be biological, stemming from an unhelpful lack of activity in the brain when a situation should be prompting heightened awareness. And that discovery may help train at-risk people to be better at avoiding risk. Yes. It's not that people are overtly deciding to take these negative risks or do things that might get them in trouble. Says Seth Pollack, the psychology professor and investigator who has studied kids and stress for decades. It may very well be that their brains are not really processing the information that should tell them they're headed to a bad place, and this isn't the right step or action to take. Pollack and Rasmus Bryn brought back to the lab more than 50 people, as we just discussed, ages 19 to 23, that were participants in a prior study of stress hormones when they were 8. They were drawn equally from the study's least stressed and most stressed kids. Those who dealt with chronic high stress as children experienced traumatic events like parents killed by gunfire or substance abuse, multiple foster home placements, and severe maltreatment. The researchers put the adults through a series of tasks while in and out of brain scanning functional magnetic resonance imagers designed to stimulate the brain regions that weigh gain and loss, risk, and reward. The childhood stress group was less attentive to potential loss than the low childhood stress group and more piqued by resulting losses. The results were published December 4, 2017 in the journal Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences. Among the most striking outcomes, Bryn says, was watching the high-stress group work through a gambling scenario in which a token is hidden behind one of 10 squares. Some of the squares are colored red, others blue. The object is to choose the color of the square covering the token. Most people, if you see 9 red squares, 1 blue square, and the token is randomly placed, you're going to guess a red, he says. And yet, in a lot of these individuals who experienced high childhood stress, we saw they're betting on the 1 instead of the 9. They're betting against the odds again and again. And they spent a longer time doing it, according to Pollack, agonizing over the decision before making a poor decision again. That is so sad and relatable. It was our observation, not that they couldn't do math, but that they weren't really attending to the right things. We didn't see people improving over time. You might say, well, they don't get how it works. But the people with high stress childhoods, even after many trials, they weren't using negative feedback to change their behavior and improve. Again, very sad. The results have drawn interest from child welfare authorities and family court judges who are often in the position of trying to change behavior by threatening or applying punishment. No, in some cases, they might enjoy punishment. In brain scans from the people who lived with high stress as children, Bryn and Pollack could see a surprisingly low amount of activity in the brain region expected to light up when confronted by a potential loss. And then, when they would lose, we would see more activity than expected, an overreaction in the part of the brain that responds to reward. Pollack says, which makes sense. If you didn't catch the clue that you were likely to lose, you're probably going to be pretty shocked when you don't win. I think that adults who had high stress as children or childhood trauma, I think that they tend to be overly sensitive anyways. They have overreactions to things. they overly share. There's a lack of boundaries. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The high stress childhood group also reported undertaking more risky behaviors: smoking, not wearing seatbelts while in the car, while driving on a regular basis. So they do this behavior repeatedly. Interestingly, it was just the childhood stress level, not the level of stress in their current adult lives, that was the predictive of their ability to identify potential loss or avoid risky behavior. The researchers' knowledge of the subject's childhood stress is unique. Typically, assessing the childhood of a group of adults requires relying on their own recollections and spotty records. But we knew these people when they were kids, says Pollock. We have a clinical assessment of their stress levels in childhood. That was done at that time in their lives while their parents sat in the waiting room. That's powerful data. The results are powerful too, and have already drawn interest from the courts and child welfare authorities. Quote, so many of our behavioral interventions are predicated on the idea that people will understand they're about to be punished. Maybe people can be taught to spot potential loss and risk. Understanding the brain mechanisms that contribute to repeated poor judgment could illuminate ways to prevent it. Quote, what are they paying attention to? What associations from past experience are they able to remember and connect? Can we help them make better observations and predictions? Pollock says framing behavioral problems as a learning problem opens up new doors of what we can do to help people. Next, the researchers plan to expand the scope of their brain scans and analyses. Quote, now that we have this finding, we can use it to guide us to look at specific networks in the brain that are active and functionally connected. And so this is where they concluded that we might find childhood stress reshapes the way connections happen in the brain. So what that kind of means is that when you've had childhood trauma, your brain changes. It like rewires itself. You like literally have brain damage. So many of these people feel damaged. Well, you are. Like, you literally have brain damage. And so, obviously, I can relate to a lot of this stuff. I thought it was interesting. And another interesting thing is I have read that adults who have had the high stress as a child or childhood trauma, or that had PTSD as like a teenager or whatever, they produce the same kind of brain scans as traumatized war veterans. So think about what that means, right? Due to the fact that prolonged childhood stress focuses so much of their brain activity on certain parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functioning or higher reasoning, lags in normal development. This produces a defective or compromised decision-making center, literal brain damage. So people who were abused as kids have issues. They have trouble forming healthy and normal relations. They want so badly to have these normal relationships that are like balanced and decent and normal. But when they show up, it makes them scared. You get uncomfortable. You get anxiety, you become very nervous, maybe even suspicious of people who are being too nice to you, if that makes sense, or people that haven't like harmed you yet. It's weird for us. We know how to deal with being rejected, hurt, and neglected, and we feel really uncomfortable when we have to be responsible for a relationship, or when we have to show up and let people in or let people get close to us, and we have to reveal things about ourselves, often very personal things. So people that had abusive, neglectful childhoods, they get really good at like putting up walls So to keep people out and putting forward like a fake version of themselves, it's not that they're being inauthentic or anything like that. It's just that they want you to think everything is great and everything is fine. Maybe in the past, when you shared things that made you really vulnerable with somebody, like maybe you told them about something that happened to you when you were a child, or you tell them about something that like really scares you, like something that you have a lot of fear about, they then use these weaknesses against you to hurt you. So, for example, if they know you're really scared of being abandoned, they will purposely abandon you to like do the one thing they know will like really mess with you. Maybe that has made it hard for you to trust people or feel safe being yourself. If you had parents who abandoned you as a child or withheld affection and love, maybe you learn to be a people pleaser to try to get that love that you didn't have as a child from other people. And that makes it really easy for people to manipulate you. This affects your entire life. If you haven't had any counseling, if you haven't had any healing, most people who have had childhood trauma or PTSD turn to extremely toxic behaviors, engage in self-harm, or abuse drugs and alcohol, trying to cope or bury their feelings of shame, sadness, and pain, or just numb all feelings at all. Many people fall into toxic patterns of behavior that become like these self-fulfilling prophecies or cycles of abuse that can be very destructive and crushing. Like you end up re-traumatizing yourself over and over again. That's just how it is. Some of these things are like black and white thinking, being drawn to like really extreme views or behaviors, or being drawn to like figures of authority because you lacked that as a child, like a dominant person that you can look up to. It can also manifest as constant outrage, constant emotional responses to things like current events or the news, with a lack of nuanced understanding. So like it's all or nothing. Neglect of yourself. Maybe you don't do the things that you want to do or pursue the dreams that you have because you feel like you don't matter. For some people, this can manifest as like poor hygiene, dressing like a slob, not caring about your appearance, not bathing regularly or properly or like frequently enough, not getting the proper dental or medical care, not exercising, not eating right, maybe becoming obese via the addicting use of food, or develop an eating disorder because it is a way to exert the control that you lacked as a child. You felt like you had no control, and an eating disorder can make you feel like you're in control of something. Maybe you cut yourself to externalize the internal pain that you feel. Maybe you engage in harmful and dangerous sexual behaviors with people. Media, internet, or entertainment addiction. I think everybody can relate to this, at least a little bit. Constantly watching the TV or browsing YouTube or Gab TV or Odyssey or whatever, right? The obsessive use of social media. This has created a lot of like narcissistic young women and men too, I guess. Constant browsing of the internet addiction. The internet, for some, can provide like a safe space for self-expression, especially if you're able to do it anonymously. You don't have to have it linked to yourself, so you can kind of do things online that maybe you wouldn't do in person. It also provides a place for escapism, for fantasy and magical thinking. Maybe you spend hours playing video games to the point it begins to interfere with like your sleep or your real world relationships. I think everybody is aware of like the kinds of young men that spend 12 hours a day or more playing video games, that literally like eating tendies off of their chest, and their room is like a pigsty and they're not bathing, they're just like constantly in this fake video game world, and that's where like all of their relationships come from. That's, I think everybody knows like that that's not healthy. Dishonesty. Sometimes people who have been abused or traumatized as children tend to lie about things or exaggerate. They don't do this in like a intentionally dishonest way, but they don't want to reveal things about themselves. So instead, they turn to sort of like lying about little things, lies by omission. In more extreme cases, it can manifest as stealing, cheating, gambling, dangerous or thrill-seeking behaviors. Work problems, staying at a job that you hate or find unfulfilling, going through like many periods of unemployment, or like going from job to job to job and feeling miserable at like every place that you go, feeling like you can't relate to anybody or any of your coworkers, like you don't fit in, you're unhappy. This can lead to getting into fights and confrontations with coworkers or your bosses. You might engage in conflict at work with people that you view as like a threat, right? This can lead to you intimidating or harassing or undermining other people. And then on the other end, conversely, it can lead to letting yourself get used by others and treated like a doormat, staying late and not getting paid for it, coming in on the weekends, doing somebody else's job, picking up the slack for somebody else, and not really getting any benefit out of that, and allowing people to kind of put all of their own responsibilities onto you, and you just take all of this stuff onto yourself as if you're responsible for it when you're not. And in a way, I feel like that is like self-punishing behavior. Blame. Blaming others for things that you yourself did. Not being able to see your role in issues or problems. Victim blaming. Bitterness, rage, saying hurtful things to other people, thinking everybody's like out to get you. This is something that I have dealt with a lot. I still have this feeling like you think that everybody hates you, or everybody is like secretly trying to mess with you, and it's really sad. It doesn't feel good to think that like when people give you a compliment or something, or somebody is nice to you, that like they can't actually mean it. They're just doing it for some like ulterior motive or whatever. It's just like, it's so awful. It's an awful feeling because it just feels like, I don't know. It feels like everybody hates you, and then you hate yourself, but it's just like a manifestation of your own self-loathing and thinking that you don't deserve people to love you or care about you. And then thinking all of your problems are due to external factors that are outside of your control. Like nothing that happens to you is your own fault. It's always some circumstance or somebody else's problem. Somebody did something that caused you to have a bad day, and that's why you got fired from your job. It wasn't your own behavior. Numbing yourself with drugs or alcohol that prevents you from addressing the underlying spiritual illness and feelings that you have and the trauma that you have, and using substances to self-medicate this. I think that everybody can probably relate to this. This is probably common even for people who don't have like childhood trauma in PTSD. Irritability. People that have had childhood trauma and that people that have PTSD sometimes get angry for no reason, or there is a reason, something has triggered it, but you can't identify what that was, what triggered like your anger. So sometimes like you'll pick fights with people to try to get them to leave before they can like voluntarily abandon you. So, you know, say you have like somebody that you're just developing a friendship with them and they're a nice person, and you're just kind of like waiting for them to do something really mean or abusive or hurtful, and it doesn't happen, and it makes you feel really weird, like something isn't right. And so you feel like they're not going to stick around, or something's going to happen like that. And so you kind of like make it happen. Like you'll pick at them or pick a fight with them, and then you'll use that as an excuse to like end the relationship before the person can get any closer to you, because then they might just abandon you, and you wouldn't want that. Ranting and venting, and that can go all the way to becoming so enraged that you get violent or like throw things. I'm sure everyone can relate to this at least once, right? I used to like throw shoes and stuff when I was really mad. The venting thing though, and the ranting, like a lot of people do this online, especially if they can do it like anonymously, right? This can be like shit posting or something, or just like arguing with retarded people on the internet. But it can also be it can manifest as like oversharing with people, this sort of like venting inappropriately with people that you just met, where you just kind of like bleh, and tell them all this stuff that they really don't need to know, and they haven't told you all of this stuff about them. And so it's just like you talking about yourself, and it can come off as very narcissistic and bizarre. An attraction to troubled people. People that have been abused and traumatized tend to become attracted to other people who have also been abused and traumatized. We end up attracted to people with serious problems. That can be legal, financial, people with substance abuse issues, people who are constant drama and conflict, because that is what is familiar to you, and you can relate to that behavior. You understand it. Obviously, I'm sure everybody has heard of like trauma bonding. So often people who have been abused and traumatized as children mistake toxic behavior for love, because they're getting some form of attention, even if it's negative attention, or if it's like overwhelming or over the top behavior. It's like twisting that and thinking that means that it's like something profound rather than something sick. Unfulfilling romantic life. Many people that have been traumatized or have PTSD avoid romantic relationships because they avoid most people in general. Or they might stay in a toxic or bad relationship, or maybe they stay in one where there's no real intimacy or spiritual connection. Sometimes they do that to avoid getting hurt or because it's easier. But you still feel internal pain every day. It's just in a different way. So again, it's not very productive. These are all things that will like re-traumatize you. Abuse of your sexuality. Many people who've been traumatized as children, as adults, they dress overly sexually, or they like engage in inappropriate, seductive, or sexual behaviors with a lack of boundaries. They have a disordered sense of the kinds of signals or like messaging that they're sending to other people, and that is because of PTSD. It's like a distorted sense of self. So, fantasy. This is something many children who were traumatized learned to do to escape and cope so their souls would not be crushed and would survive intact. You create like a fantasy world where you're actually a princess, and somewhere some prince will come one day and save you, or you're some kind of like, you have a secret superpower and you could like kill anybody if you really wanted to. Whatever. It's just like wishful and magical thinking. Unrealistic expectations, unrealistic goals. Some people do this to such an extreme degree that they are not even present, like they're just not there, or they're not like in touch with reality. And this can lead to stalking behaviors and obsessions that are very unhealthy. Avoidance, avoiding anything that causes you any kind of like pain or sadness, avoiding people or any situations where you could get hurt, avoiding responsibilities or participating in things. Sometimes this happens when relationships with others in the past have proven unsafe or painful. So we just detach altogether from like the world and become like a hermit, isolating yourself from others to protect yourself. I'm sure everyone can relate to that to a degree. Financial mismanagement, not taking care of your responsibilities. This is like the prior one, avoidance, not being able to make the right decisions and risk analysis that leads to in extreme cases, serious loss and like homelessness, because you're not paying attention to how much money you're spending versus how much money you have. You're not paying attention to like what your bills are, and it's just horrible financial mismanagement. Repeating abuse or trauma patterns. People with trauma can have a surprising inability to detect bad people or other troubled people or people with bad intentions or dangerous situations. So they fall back into a traumatized state, which can trigger depression, substance abuse, rage and anger, collapse or breakdown, and reverting to old behaviors like a childlike state of helplessness. So these are all things that like re-traumatize yourself, that people who've been traumatized do over and over and over again. And it becomes just like this cycle of self-harm and abuse. And I think that the other thing, though, that is important to realize is even people who've had really bad childhoods and have had really bad abuse or really bad things happen to them that have PTSD, they don't do all of these. It's not necessarily they do all of them. Maybe they have a couple of these things that they kind of fall into that re-traumatize them. But everybody, to a degree, has some of these problems regardless. So it's not that big of a deal. You can heal from it. But I think it's interesting to note that study that talked about people that have had the horrible childhood traumas, like literally having brain damage and the inability to like that repeat like poor judgment, and the inability to know that like they're going to lose, or that they're not doing the right thing, and then doing it over and over and over again. That to me is very interesting, because if they're able to see this on brain scans, if you're able to see that people with childhood trauma are the same as like traumatized war veterans, then maybe they should get the same kind of like treatment or counseling, the same type of like PTSD treatment that you would give a veteran. Maybe we should give to people that were traumatized as kids. So I just thought that was interesting, and I wanted to share that. What do you guys think? Let me know. I'm sure there's more studies out there too. I just find it very sad. I think it's sad that there's so many people who have issues like this, that it just goes like totally untreated and unrecognized, and people don't like to talk about it because it's weird and it makes you feel like, like you're weak or something. And I don't think that's the case.